it's great to have this topic because I'm passionate about water and passionate about justice. So it's nice to think about how we bring the two together. And before my PhD, I was more interested in activism than academia, but then I guess I wasn't very good at it. So I ended up being an academic, but I guess now we can do scholarly activism, which I think we're all committed to doing. So let's just start with some broad overview. As you know, water is life. It's essential for human well-being. It's the lifeblood of the planet's ecosystems. Yet, as we know from the 2006 Human Development Report, no act of terrorism generates devastation on a daily basis on the scale of the crisis in water and sanitation. But this is largely a very invisible and silent crisis, and it remains quasi-naturalized. That is, it is accepted as part of life by those who make decisions and those who enjoy guaranteed access to water and sanitation and safe water and sanitation, and the millions who don't. So we know the stats, the global stats, despite decades and decades of global development, as well as water and sanitation action, we're talking about 26% of the global population lacking safe drinking water and about 46% lacking access to safely managed sanitation. And the big ticking bomb is actually domestic wastewater, which is untreated, especially in rapidly urbanizing spaces. So we're talking about 56% of that population. And unlike the right to food and the other rights, the right to water and sanitation was only globally endorsed after a lot of struggle in 2010, and it's still very contested. And these rights remain on paper for millions and millions of rural and urban poor people. And there are precious few means of holding powerful global state and private actors to account for daily violations of human rights to water and sanitation. Now, while much is made about the global water crisis and global water scarcity, we know from many, many different authoritative UN reports and other reports that there's enough water and food to go around. So while water availability differs drastically around the globe from region to region, differences in access are mostly due to politics, public policy, lack of capacity and investment, flawed water management strategies, as well as exclusions due to geography, topography, gender, ethnicity, caste, race, and class. And so it's very easy for mainstream water portrayals, and indeed a lot of governance is based on this, to look at water scarcity as something that's physical, volumetric, and natural. But in reality, it's mostly exacerbated or even caused as a result of socio-political processes. So in a way, water crises and water injustices are largely caused and legitimized by different forms of unequal gender, social, and power relations, as well as structural violence vis-a-vis poor and marginalized people. So this kind of structural violence took place in apartheid South Africa, and we'll hear about that. It takes place on a daily basis in different parts of the world, sort of low caste people in India excluded. Millions of women and girls spend hours collecting water, and this naturalized gender nature of water collection has undermined their health, education, and chances in life. And of course, climate change exacerbates all this, and ever-increasing extreme weather events affect everyone on the globe, but most negatively affect the vulnerable, the most vulnerable, the most poor, and the most marginalized. Now, you asked me to talk about water governance. Water governance sets the rules, access rights, tools, mostly economic, and accountability mechanisms for how water is both managed and allocated across scales. In a way, it's formal and informal, but the formal tend to override in official water management and water governance processes. So customary and informal arrangements in which poor water users, such as women farmers, pastoralists, and smallholders have rights to water and land, are often ignored in formal water arrangements. So most mainstream water governance processes remain contested, fragmented, and highly unequal. Water allocation regimes are mediated through institutions, property rights, identity, and culture. They can range from government or public systems to user-based or market systems. But in practice, often water flows uphill to power and money. Despite a lot of reform processes that are meant to be fair, for example, IWRM, etc., they're meant to do something properly, but they remain abstract, so they often override a lot of on-the-ground processing. So in reality, cultural, ethnic, gender discrimination constitute implicit or explicit axes to privilege water rights to some over others. Now, a lot of current and past water injustice has taken place due to water grabbing in relation to a wide range of activity that spans the food, water, energy, climate, and mineral domains. And this is because of the fluid and liquid nature of the resource, its fluctuating variability across time and space, and multiple scales, so upstream, downstream, across the watershed or basin. And all of these have tremendous impacts on water allocation, reallocation, distribution, and quality, both now and in the future. Hydrological complexity, and in particular surface water, groundwater interactions, and interannual variability add to this complexity. So these fluid properties of the resource interact with the slippery nature of the grabbing process, which is namely unequal power relations, fuzziness between legality and illegality, formal and informal processes, unclear administrative boundaries and jurisdictions, and also it's an unlevel playing field, fraught negotiation processes. So this makes water grabbing a site for tremendous injustice, especially for smallholders and invisible users of land and water who lack formal titles to their resources. And through these processes, large companies, states, corporations are able to take control of and reallocate to their own benefit water resources used by local communities or ecosystems on which their livelihoods are based. So it's one manifestation of a global trend involving large-scale reallocations of natural resources more generally. Now, a lot of official water management and water governance discourses, for example, such as those endorsed in the 1992 Dublin Principles, have tended to focus on the economic values of water more than others. Even though there are several principles, these are the ones that tend to dominate. And viewing more water through an economic lens, for example, as an economic good, can undermine its embeddedness in the everyday symbolic, cultural, and social context within which people live their lives. So this also intensifies processes of commodification and privatization in many parts of the global south, which have tended to bypass the poorest and also violate people's rights to water. And in the UK, it means a lot of shit in our streams, in our seas, and also very unequal processes, cut-offs, price rises, etc. So water as a resource is a source for both profound cooperation. There's a lot of water cooperation too, but I'm not talking much about that, and conflict. It's a source of deep injustice and struggles for life. There are competing claims from industry, agriculture, urbanization, and indeed nature, the rivers, and injustice concerning how you determine what is good quality or not, what is good quantity or not, different meanings, knowledges that shape control and distribution. And in all these struggles, invariably, it's poor and marginalized women, men, urban poor that tend to lose. So how can we conceptualize water justice or injustice? Inspired by Nancy Fraser, normally justice looks at different dimensions. The procedural, for example, who decides which stakeholders count and which don't. The distributional, who gains and loses. But then increasingly, we also have to look at recognitional values, for example, plural notions of value based on diverse claims and identities. For example, that of Indigenous people and their ontologies and their perspectives rarely count. And indeed also epistemic or cognitive aspects of justice. Whose knowledge counts? Whose values counts? And I mean, it's fair to say that a lot of the mainstream governance processes have tended to privilege one kind of framing or one kind of more technocentric knowledge around water by the big players, as opposed to looking at place-based understandings of water, of rivers, of that of Indigenous groups. So these are often disregarded over cost-benefit analysis and monetary values. And these are what determine decision-making processes. So place-based bottom-up views regarding water justice that value the views and perspectives of vulnerable and marginalized populations are key, but these are often excluded from water and sanitation programs due to epistemic, recognitional, and distributional injustices. So here, epistemic or knowledge justice is really important in determining whose knowledge counts, whose values counts, who participates in decision-making processes, in agenda setting, and also how accountability is established. And finally, global north frameworks, knowledges, academic knowledge, scholarship, etc., can also erode other ways of conceptualizing or reconceptualizing water justice or experiences of knowledge. So this calls for decolonizing and also pluralizing water justice and what it means and how it is being realized in diverse contexts. So let me just end by two examples. So one is from an ongoing GCRF project called Towards Brown Gold, where we're looking at sanitation and wastewater management in off-grid settings in rapidly growing cities across Asia and Africa. And in many of these programs, so take India, for example, the National Sanitation Campaign has focused more on the visible aspects of sanitation or being on the grid. That means in terms of toilet construction and connections, but this does not really address the dangerous, invisible aspects of non-network systems, such as poor, unsafe excreta disposal, inadequate fecal sludge management, but all these disproportionately affect the poor, migrants, Dalits, low castes, and poor citizens. And a lot of the off-grid populations are migrants who often don't have paper. They live in slums, transgender people, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, disabled people, etc. And the burden of also managing a lot of these non-network systems fall on informal sanitation workers who remain discriminated, who are at the bottom of the pile. Many of them are manual scavengers, even though this is actually prohibited by law. So these toilets are connected to open drains, they choke. So in other words, sanitation injustices are also linked with water injustices, and they also go hand in hand. Now, finally, as conflicts rage in Ukraine, in parts of the Middle East, and in Africa, water infrastructures become fair game, and its water is a weapon of war. So I just want to conclude now. After the Hamas attacks on Israel in October 23, Israel cut off water supplies to Gaza, contributing to the ongoing famine. More than half of Gaza's water and wastewater infrastructure has been damaged, leaving civilians dehydrated and at risk of severe disease, with children forced to drink polluted or salinated water. The depletion of fuel supplies has led to a further collapse in water production, reducing water supplies for drinking water and sanitation, with residents actually only having access to about 1 to 3 liters for their needs. The minimum humanitarian standard is 15 liters of water, according to the WHO. Even before the war, Palestinians face profound water-related injustices. They have access to about a fourth or a third of water compared with Israelis. Ramallah has the same amount of rainfall as in Berlin and London, but there still is, or has been, or was, a water crisis there, emanating from strict policies and a long history of illegal settlements. Due to military and other rulings, Palestinians are not allowed to drill wells and collect water from their rooftops. By contrast, settlers in the West Bank enjoy abundant water. Discourses such as making the desert bloom and creating abundance among scarcity have justified historical land and water grabs. So in Gaza, we have a situation from a relative water security where we now have water insecurity, dehydration, and famine. Women don't even have water to wash their hair, so they're shaving off their hair. We know that the WHO has warned of the risk of spread of infectious disease and the overall collapse of the water system. So to conclude, water is a basic human right, and denying this right in times of conflict violates international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions. This constitutes a war crime. The weaponization of water from Gaza to Ukraine to Tigray in northern Ethiopia constitute the worst form of water injustices in current times. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those incredibly powerful and important comments. And already I feel like you brought to life the complexity and the emotionality of water injustice. So thank you so much. And yeah, really great to see, to hear the framing around intersectionality at the beginning, thinking about through different axes of discrimination, which leads really nicely into our next speaker, Professor Farhana Sultana. Farhana is a professor in the Department of Geography and the Environment at Syracuse University, traveled all the way from the US to be with us, so thank you so much. She's an internationally recognized activist, scholar, speaker, and author. She's broadly interested in water, climate, critical development studies, transnational feminist theories, and decolonizing knowledge, among others. So I think you've got some slides. I'm going to share those with the online, but I think Farhana's going to help us to answer the question, how do critical feminist approaches help us to better understand urban water injustice? So over to you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Catherine and Michael, for organizing this panel and for inviting us. Thank you to everyone who's here online and in the future will be watching us somewhere from their home or office. So today I'll be sharing very briefly some insights from a research project, one of my many research projects. And this one's on urban climate and water injustice and how that feeds into various forms of social marginalization and social inequities. So since a global climate breakdown has caught public attention, what's happened is that we've noticed a lot more discourse on climate justice alongside water justice. So what I try to bring is a more international and intersectional perspective via case studies in megacities across the global south, because climate change is effectively water change, right? Too much water, too little water, wrong time, wrong place, wrong quality, and so on. So megacities in, for instance, places like monsoonal deltas that face various water-related crises help us understand that microcosm of the inequities that water can hold. And this case study that I want to highlight shows my very feminist perspectives in unearthing the injustices that exist. And the overarching research was to focus how in the developing world, the discourse of climate adaptation that has taken hold is often problematically rolled out, and it is water and humans and ecosystems that pay the price. So I'm just going to be discussing in very broad brushstrokes, given the time, what climate adaptation and water justice means on the ground, vis-a-vis people's perceptions of attitudes towards and lived experiences of climate change and water insecurity, alongside issues such as flooding and drinking water access. So we need to therefore focus on the politics of climate adaptation, because what is often sacrificed is water security in the process. So the place that I'll be focusing on for this particular talk is an ongoing project in Dhaka, Bangladesh. So Dhaka is the capital of Bangladesh, and it is, I don't know why it's jumping around. Very strange. My apologies.
Probably
I don't know what's happening.
add an animation.
Yeah, and I don't know why that's not playing, so I'm just gonna leave it. Oh, it's playing now. There we go. Magic. You had to say the word animation. So the context is that it's a monsoonal climate. It's a delta, as you saw in the animation that came on late, in terms of how green the space is, but also how urbanized it is as you zoom in. It is also very much part of an ongoing active delta. It is one of the largest deltas in the world. The Ganges and Brahmaputra feed into the Bengal Delta here. And Dhaka is one of the cities that sits in a floodplain, and it's all flat. So it's very flood prone. So the overlapping climate and water injustices that exist are quite heightened in a city like Dhaka that's hemmed in by two of the largest rivers in the world. So things such as urban planning or climate adaptation or development interventions collide with global climate change to produce various injustices and vulnerabilities. So to do thorough analysis of whether climate injustice or water injustice, we need to understand both the global processes, such as global atmospheric changes, to national processes, such as budget allocation, to local issues, such as social inequities in the urban landscape. And that scalar analysis is why I'm a geographer, in case anyone didn't know. So how do we think about these issues across space, place, and scale? And think simultaneously across social inequity, local, national, and international, and how injustices play out. We can also see here that we can learn about what to do or not do in extreme cases, but then we can also think about how it applies to other different contexts, even if this may not feel like home to you. So Dhaka, like many other cities of the global south, is a city of contrasts. So as you can see in the photos, like many rapidly growing urban megacities around the world, it is not only historically crisscrossed by rivers, canals, and lakes, but as urbanization took forth, especially under the edicts of modernity and modernization and what meant to be a good development subject, it became a concretized jungle. As a result, you have a city of haves and have-nots. The haves live in the high rises with swimming pools on the top and the rooftop. And they have secure housing with access to networked water and sanitation and drainage facilities. But the have-nots, which is about a third to half of the city, do not have those things. They cannot take that for granted. They cannot take housing for granted. They do not have right to housing. They do not have the right to water. They do not have the right to even justice. Often they do not have the right to claim themselves as to be treated with human dignity. So the inadequate provision of infrastructure and housing and amenities result in that kind of heterogeneous landscape of extremely clean, tidy, wealthy people who can maneuver the landscape with ease versus those who cannot afford hygiene and good health or proper bathing facilities, who live in the informal settlements, often euphemistically called slums. So what I call this is hydroapartheid, which can be linked to climate apartheid, which scholars have theorized at a much more global scale. But again, like we said, climate change is water change, right? So when we think about this kind of hydroapartheid at a city scale, we can really think about how the lack of coordinated planning in urbanization causes waterlogging. So there's severe drainage problems. So you've got poop in the water in London and you've got poop in the water in Dhaka, one because of treatment problems in London and the other because of overflow of drainage facilities in Dhaka, but you still have poop in the water, right? So whether you're drinking it, you're surrounded by, you're stepping in it, these kinds of issues in monsoonal climates mean that in the monsoon season, you're really drowned out. It is flooding everywhere. And this hydrosocial cycle that impacts everyday life means that the poorer population really lack a lot of things, whether it's ventilated housing or issues around access to water for cleanliness or hygiene or even cooking. And these people are the people who keep the formal economy going. They're the informal economy workers. So they're shopkeepers, cleaners, beggars, rickshaw pullers, maids, factory workers, and so on. Without them, the economy would collapse in every country. But given all these urban injustices that exist in such a city, the variable vulnerabilities and the histories and threat exposures, whether from a public health perspective or from the perspective of water injustice, or what it means to be a scholar activist, we can't really separate them out from the wider history of urban planning and how people's perceptions of, attitudes towards, and lived experiences of climate and urban life changes every day. So this brings me to the next issue, and I titled this Water, Water Everywhere, but Not a Drop to Drink or Bathe or Wash Hands With, especially during the pandemic when washing hands was so critical. So we saw the spatial inequities in terms of the slums versus, the haves in the built environment, but that is mapping out by class. But we can also do what, as feminists do, which is intersectional analysis and how that overlaps with gender and patriarchy. So you have to bring forth issues that are contextually relevant, whether that's class, race, gender, and so on, but also disability and sexuality play critical roles, as well as age. So on top of these gendered inequalities that are exacerbated by the differential vulnerabilities that exist, but then compounded by heat stress, water insecurity, flooding, and waterlogging, and the greater burden of providing drinking water to the home, which is primarily falling on what women and girls because of the gender division of labor and the expectations of patriarchy. And as a result, these household requirements result in girls staying back from school, or women having to juggle both factory work or being a maid or a shopkeeper, along with trying to provide water for their home, whether that's for cooking, bathing, or washing, or procuring money to purchase it, whether legally or illegally. So water, therefore, is very much not only a class issue, but a gendered issue. in landscapes of water insecurity. And this is being heightened and fueled by climate injustices because climate is causing various forms of water stress in terms of unpredictable rainfall, too much rainfall or too little, and increasing drought and desertification. But a third aspect in which we can see water injustices play out in the urban landscape is through flooding and waterlogging. So flooding can happen when there's extreme amounts of rainfall that cannot flow away or be drained. But it can also be through flooding because of monsoonal rainfall and river overflowing its banks. So this waterlogging that's increased with concretization, because hey, the more concrete you pour, the less water is going to permeate, right? And go back to the aquifer that the city relies on. So the prolonged and increased erratic monsoonal rainfall, along with haphazard urban planning, ends up colliding to create scattered landscapes of water insecurity, waterlogging, and polluted water, contaminating people's homes, feet, clothes, and so on. So when we think about the politics of climate adaptation and climate justice, that is often assumed to be inherently just or equitable. We should not assume that, because once we look at it through an intersectional feminist lens or through a water lens, it means that we need to be able to understand all the injustices and the stressors that exist that come from biophysical, social, economic, and various local historical factors. And these are often interlinked and interconnected. And this is why climate justice and water justice are related. So communities and individuals can be made more vulnerable through these processes. They do compound ongoing sufferings. So you can suffer for water, but you can also suffer from water. You can suffer for clean water and suffer from dirty water. And the differential power relations and access to decision-making and allocation of resources end up creating more complex scenarios of suffering than we can imagine. And there are no easy solutions to work across all different places, but it is really imperative to investigate, expose, and understand the various interconnected injustices, especially in marginalized spaces, so that we can strive to do better. So in conclusion, I'm just going to rush through these bullet points, and I'm happy to elaborate that, what do we mean by megacities and urban and water injustice? And when you look at it through that feminist intersectional lens, what conclusions do I come to? And this is part of a forthcoming paper. So it is that these are complex, challenging problems, as I've kind of sort of demonstrated. That these are global and local and socially complex. But these are also overlapping crises that contrast in different ways. And we cannot divorce them from different historical, social, spatial, and political processes. But then these are also scalar and intersectional issues. And we have to apply those lenses. Otherwise, we're doing a huge disservice to any narrative we put forth or policies we conjure up. And this means that we have a lot of work to do coming up. And that there are varied vulnerabilities and exposures that are hard to measure, but really important to investigate, usually through qualitative research. And often you'll find yourself becoming an activist through this kind of research, because that is the kind of work it is. But at the same time, you learn to realize that there are, the local voices and power relations really matter, but they're often not heeded by both national governments, but also local governments, and definitely global governments. And in terms of what we can do better as academics, we can practice deep listening and careful research, much more ethical research that practices reflexive, deep listening, where we learn to decenter ourselves as researchers or scholars or activists, but recenter those whose voices have been left out historically. And recognize that any discourse around adaptation is not technical or an apolitical process, but it is entirely about water, even though people may not approach it as a water issue, but climate is entirely about water issues. And I think I've been banging on about this for about 20 years. So I'm going to end on time, and I'll rush through this very, very quickly. Basically, just to kind of say that, I'm happy to elaborate on this further, but when you think about these injustices and what we think about climate injustices or water governance and water security, these are very much issues around these complex issues, and it behooves us to do better. And I invite you all to read up on the various types of scholarship that exist, especially outside of hegemonic canon. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's really helpful to see the issues brought to life with the case study of Taka. It's really nice. And to explore some more of the mechanisms through which water injustices play out through flooding, scarcity, quality, and the different sort of structural drivers, intersectionality, marginality, power, uneven power relations. So thank you. And that leads us into our next speaker, Dr. Matthew Wingfield, who's going to give us some more insights into different structural drivers of water injustice. So Matthew's a research fellow at Stellenbosch University. His work focuses on environmental activism and climate justice in post-apartheid South Africa. He actively lobbies the South African government for climate justice in his role as the Political Education and Climate Science Secretary of the Climate Justice Charter movement in South Africa. So Matthew, I think you're going to talk a bit about the South African context and help us to answer the question, why is it so important to consider historical injustices when seeking to understand and challenge today's unequal access to water?
Well, thank you very much, Catherine. And firstly, just thank you so much for being a collaborator over these many months. I think Catherine and I have been thinking about doing this for a long time, and coordinating a panel, certainly an esteemed panel like this, is quite tricky, but it's definitely worth the effort, and it's been a lot of fun working with you. And thank you, Lyla, Verona, and Sam for being here. Yes, that's Sam's slide. Okay, that's perfect. No, that's cool. That's fine. So yes, firstly, Catherine and I thought about this panel as water researchers or people that work on environmental justice, environmental rights, and kind of trying to understand where we are as we all read in the news, this kind of IPCC debate around these futures that are so dire. And there's an academic framing around it, and there's a lot of scholarship happening, certainly around water. So we're trying to figure out, and this is why we wanted to advertise it so widely, we're trying to find the value of what the academic debate is, but also what is how can the academic debate be bridged into kind of practical real life work and the activism that we all do. And as we've said, and the first two panelists have already said, academia can be and is very activist driven, right? But my work has been working with activists, in South Africa for a long time. And as Catherine says, I do hold an activist position in South Africa. So I want to raise some of the questions that we've been thinking about from South Africa, which firstly, this kind of broader narrative around, increasing global temperatures, etc. The South African the national debate is very different, where if the world goes up 1.5, you hear about 1.5 and going up 1.5 degrees. South Africa heats it twice the global rate. So we have a 3 degrees rise in South Africa. So the dire nature of climate mitigation and adaptation becomes even more important in South Africa, I think. So my contribution rather is framed in this broader debate around the Anthropocene, right? This kind of the anthropos, we are all together to blame in some ways, and we all need to act to solve climate injustice. And I trouble that by, highlighting its limited understanding of the practices and geographies which the climate crisis comes from. And it's interesting giving a presentation in the UK with the relationship between South Africa and the UK historically, and certainly the African continent being seen as a site of extraction, resource extraction, right? With that, it comes in a very difficult position now, where the African continent will see a lot of the most harmful effects of the climate crisis. So it's extracted from historically, but now we'll find more effect from the climate crisis. But talking about water, the history of Cape Town, certainly in South Africa, and the history of South Africa more generally, is often spoken through, racial injustice, colonial resource frontiers. But the castle of Good Hope in Cape Town was infrastructure laid over the fresh river, the Farsha River, which was meant to control, and who controlled the Castle of Good Hope was the question of who controlled the water. And I think we need to really repoliticize control of water, as Veron and Lyla already have, not only and the infrastructures that interact with water. So but also the displacement that happened in South Africa's history and certainly Cape Town's history. And this is all I'm trying to raise. I'm going to get to day zero and the drought that we had in Cape Town. But all these histories, as Veron and Lyla have said, these histories are so important in understanding what the climate crisis is doing and what kind of practices are important for mitigating and dealing with the climate crisis, right? It's not an apolitical, I think, and this is some activists and people I work with, they see it as a global challenge and they remove the politics and certainly the histories away from climate justice. And I think that's problematic. But with the Dutch and British coming into South Africa and across the world and foreclosing the water commons, as they call it, they also renegotiated or reinscribed water with a different type of relationship. What was the relationship pre-colonial to water and what is the relationship now? And I think we take for granted what our relationship is and the way we interact with water more generally. So, but also what is problematic and that is, really hidden, I think, in the global climate narratives is this kind of linear scale to scarcity. There was abundance in Cape Town, abundance of water historically, and then it's a linear narrative to there will be scarcity. As Verona and Lyla have both already said, water variability is very important, right? It's not only about scarcity, it's also about flooding. So trying to understand how that complicates the way we act and politicize water is very interesting. If it was only scarcity, and this is something I'll speak around Cape Town and the Day Zero crisis, that can bring out its own politics, this increasing scarcity and who has access to water when there is little water. So the Day Zero drought is framed by the city of Cape Town and others as this kind of linear narrative to scarcity where it went from abundance to little water. But it's also mapped onto these histories of racialized infrastructure and the enclosure of water. So who gets access to water historically? And then more importantly, who in the moment of crisis, in the moment of scarcity gets access to water? As Lyla and Verona again have said, and I just feel like I'm repeating everything they said, but these kind of the questions around scarcity and certainly around scarcity have been mapped historically. So scarcity is not something that happens now because we're in this climate crisis. Scarcity is a political decision, and there's agency behind the scarcity. And the scarcity 20 years ago, 100 years ago in South Africa, and now, and will be continue to go forward, right? So I think we need to repoliticize who gets access to water, and this is sort of the political economy of water, which I'll leave alone. But Cape Town's Day Zero drought is seen as this kind of, it was caused by elite consumption, which is true in many ways. In some ways, we can challenge that, and certainly poor governance. But what happens if we buy into these narratives around elite consumption and poor governance? The kind of responses that cities have and are having to climate crises and climate shocks are seen as apolitical and they're just a techno form of governance. And I think that is probably the most misleading part of responses to the climate crisis. So what happened during the drought was, while there was increased scarcity across the society, what did the city of Cape Town do? And this is happening across the world. They put in water management devices, right? And that's meant to be a technology that understands where water leakages are happening and who's using water. But the political kind of impetus that brings, and certainly the kind of governance and the biopolitical the governance of your body and the way you interact with water, it comes, is built upon that. And this is what we've seen in South Africa. So, of course, water scarcity for the poor and working class, water scarcity is a long-standing fact. And in times of crisis, I want to dispel the narrative that water scarcity is only because of this climate kind of Anthropocene, the climate crisis. This is something that is historically grounded and will be continuing through these kind of lenses. And when we have drought, as we did in Cape Town, and I'm sure Sam will speak to this more generally in the projects he works on, But what we see is the control and the governance and the response to these moments of drought and scarcity in ways that manage water, control water, and the kind of the relationships that people have with water, that in a way that reaffirms this kind of unequal, racialized, gendered governance of water. Yes. So again, the question then of just saying we need the right to water, it also forecloses a lot of possibilities. It limits it gets into these conversations of what is the capacity of the state, or what is the capacity of the legal system or the judiciary. But that there are politics that can, and climate politics, and certainly some, I'm sure, to talk about this, that can emerge outside of these kind of barriers. So when we only think about the rights of water and sort of an infrastructural approach or a legal approach, we foreclose a lot of possibilities around water. So to sort of get into the case study and start ending off, the PHA campaign where I've done work, and I didn't want to talk about it too extensively because you can read about it elsewhere. But I looked at this group of activists that try to repoliticize water and water access in a moment of scarcity. Not only thinking about who is accessing water and do we have access to the grid, which is a lot of the climate politics around and water politics around the world. Who has access to a grid that is established and who can get formalized access to that grid? That forecloses a lot of possibilities around rethinking what can water be, what can our relationships to water look like post these droughts. But only trying to think about water crises and water scarcity through a techno-managerial lens, we actually foreclose a lot of possibilities that are fundamental to so we have to rethink water and our relationships with water rather than just trying to respond to these crises. So I think the politics in these moments of crisis, in drought and flooding, we need to be really attuned not only to solving these crises very quickly, but these crises and these climate shocks are going to be reproduced. They're going to be coming more and more. So we need to think about the way in which we organize and politicize access to access to water. So what this group that I worked with did looked at agroecology as a form of repositioning soil and water, not as resources to be exploited and to be used and to be negotiated, but entities that we are in constant reproduction with. We interact with water and soil and everything, these kind of biopolitical entities constantly. And if we do it in the way that we have historically done it, and we've done it in the way that is inherited by colonial systems, and certainly the apartheid system in South Africa more specifically, these kind of relationalities aren't going to save us. And if we hope for the governance of the governance perspectives that we've had historically in these countries, in Bangladesh and other places, we likely will foreclose the possibilities of using these moments, and this is what my work does, using these moments to offer different ways of interacting with nature and each other, and this kind of relationship between human and nature, right? So, as what they did in the PHA and certainly Cape Town is just one example here, and I've written about this, but they tried to think about how underground water can not only be seen as a water resource to be accessed in time of drought, which is, we see that across the world, Verona, you raised that as well, but seen as what kind of relationalities can we have with the underground in a way that's not extractive, but there can be a mutual benefit to that. So let me end off with kind of showing that I think day zero and these climate crises and these shocks that we all seem overwhelmed by, and certainly academia and activists are overwhelmed by these crises, but they also offer possibilities and opportunities to disrupt the kind of political ecology of water and environmental resources. How do we interact with water and our environment? These moments can be critical in rethinking. But also I want to raise, through my position in the climate justice charter movement, a new perspective that we're bringing out is around the climate emergency social contract. Thinking about how do we interact in South Africa through the transition, interacting with each other in a different way, but certainly in this moment of crisis and certainly climate crisis for the South African nation and elsewhere, how do we interact? What kind of social contract will be beneficial, will be generative? And thinking about our relationship to each other, but also to environmental resources more generally. And then just the different scales and geographies of climate action. I think reproducing, trying to understand different cases as we have through this panel, and we continue to do so, is very important. Not only being allowed to be thinking with the complexity, as Farana was saying, I think is important, but also not only thinking of the urban. The urban is a very important site of climate politics and hydropolitics, but the urban is in reproduction with the rural. And I think if we only think about this kind of flooding of resources to the urban, what we foreclose in different geographies in different countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthew, for that very strong call to repoliticize or to really center politics in water, to try and make small shifts away from this very traditional technocentric approach. Yeah, really interesting to hear about the work of the activists in those kind of crises, those moments as pivotal moments for change, towards more political understandings of water. So really interesting. Thank you. Okay, with politics and activism in mind, over to Sam. So Sam Taylor co-runs End Water Poverty, which is a global civil society coalition with 160 members working across 80 countries worldwide. Sam coordinates the global Claim Your Water Rights campaign, supporting context-specific, community-led action to enforce the human rights to water and sanitation at a local and national level. So welcome, it's great to have you.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a bit about End Water Poverty and your work, and what are the kind of the key contextual considerations that shape your water justice activism?
Sure. Well, firstly, thank you very much, both of you, for organising this panel. And, it's a pleasure to speak alongside such esteemed speakers. So, yeah, it's great to be here. So End Water Poverty, as Catherine said, is a global civil society coalition, and we campaign for governments to uphold people's rights to water and sanitation. Our role is to foster solidarity between water rights activists who work in different parts of the world. So we organise events to facilitate the exchange of civil society experience and expertise. We amplify members' work at regional and international fora, and most crucially, we fund our members directly to undertake diverse community-led campaigns. We have over 150 members in around 80 different countries across the world, as you can see from this map. And our members are quite diverse, so they range from grassroots groups and community-based organisations. We have national and regional networks, INGOs, social movements, trade unions. It's our conviction that social change is powered by local and national action. Our core campaign, as Catherine mentioned, is called Claim Your Water Rights, and we've been running this campaign for about 5 years. The campaign aims to enfranchise our civil society members to enforce the international human rights framework at local and national level. To do this, we fund members to design and deliver actions that are specifically tailored to their local context. We co-created Claim Your Water Rights with a member-led task team to ensure that this global campaign always remains rooted in local realities. So, in case you're worrying, it's not up to me to prescribe our members' activism. Our members know their context far better than we do. They know what kind of campaigning is safe and effective for their context. So, in the past 5 years, our members have tested various tactics. As a generalization, members tend to start with more orthodox or polite tactics, we call them. So these are like insider lobbying, media influencing, data documentation, research, academia, before then turning to tactics that are perceived, and I'm using the word perceived here, perceived to be more confrontational or agitational, such as lodging complaints, litigation, protests, demonstration, occupation. Of course, they're people exercising their democratic rights. So, for example, we recently funded a member in Honduras called AJASA. They're following procedures at their National Congress to propose a new law that guarantees the human right for all Hondurans. They're convening, it's following all procedure. At the same time, in Thailand, we're funding a group who are supporting a rural communities class action lawsuit against a gold mining company that's owned by an Australian company. This company contaminated their water and environment. So, Claim Your Water Rights is really about embracing the diversity of members' aims and approaches. Our great strength as a coalition is our plurality. So what have we achieved through this campaign? Well, the impact of members' advocacy has been far-reaching. We've had numerous instances of legal and policy reform, influenced government's COVID-19 interventions, supported hundreds of communities around the world to successfully claim better water and sanitation services. Since 2019, we've funded 43 organizations in 17 different countries. So it's very hard to condense 5 years of complex campaigning and organizing into a short speech. But I'm going to give a few examples so you have an idea of our work. This is just a picture from Thailand. So the first one is from Enugu, Nigeria. Now Enugu is known as Coal City. It's one of Nigeria's most water scarce states. In 2019, less than 2% of households in the state capital were connected to pipe water. But since 2020, Water Poverty has supported the formation and work of the Network of Water Rights Initiative, a collective of 24 grassroots organizations. The Nawari, they're called Nawari, so I'll be referring to them as Nawari from now. The team started by conducting a statewide assessment of Enugu's water supply facilities. And they found that most of these facilities were either working at severely limited capacity or that they'd been abandoned entirely. The team then used their findings to convince Enugu's governor to declare a state of emergency in the water and sanitation sector. Nawari used community organizing and traditional and social media to great effect. So they created radio jingles that used the song Water Nugget Enemy, it's a famous song by the Nigerian activist and Afrobeat artist Fela Kuti, to capture public attention. They used radio to share testimonies from health workers and community leaders. They invited government officials on their radio shows to garner pledges live on air. And this all resulted in the reconnection of water in public places like marketplaces and in Enugu's health centres. Also, through the state of emergency declaration, they secured a series of commitments. One of these commitments was to enshrine the international human right to water in domestic law. And then in July 2021, the Enugu Water Bill was passed thanks to really persistent lobbying and media pressure. And this law explicitly recognizes water as a right and establishes an independent regulator with enforcement powers. Nawari has since been working to implement this law. So during the 2023 elections, Nawari secured a commitment from the would-be governor to make water available to all within the first 180 days of his term. After the election, Nawari then created a public countdown and a monitoring platform to hold the governor accountable for this promise. And during this time, they verified the installation of 95 public water fountains. They received numerous testimonies from communities who are now getting water. And this is largely due to the revival of the 9th Mile Water Scheme, which was originally intended to service 1 million people, but had been abandoned for 3 decades. So they revived a 3-decade-old water scheme. During this time, they also asked Enugu's governor to publicly confirm that water would not be privatized. They had to seek clarification on the involvement of this US-based contractor who had been tasked with repairing the scheme. The governor issued a written clarification that a resource as precious as water should never be privatized, and that control would be handed over to the state once the scheme had been repaired. So obviously, Nawari continued to monitor this very vigilantly. And while the government didn't fulfill their promise to make water available to all before the countdown ended, they have continued to actively fix supply issues. They've laid pipes, they've made further pledges. So as a result of Nawari's activism, the government recently announced that 5.5% of the state's annual budget would be devoted to the water sector, which is a huge prioritization. And Enugu, once known as Coal City, is now being called Water City. So Nawari, they've achieved all of this with grants from us totaling just £12,000 over 4 years. This is a genuinely transformational result. And this brings me to one of the main contextual considerations for advancing water justice: funding. Where does the money come from and who gets it? In the last 5 years, almost 90% of Water Poverty's operational budget has gone directly to our members, but our budget is tiny. In general, there's a dearth of funding for grassroots advocacy. A 2019 University of Birmingham study found that just 3.3% of development finance goes to national NGOs, even though they are cheaper, nimbler, and more effective than international agencies. Another 2023 report by Development Initiatives put that number at just 2.1%. So if we're serious about translating localization and decolonization from rhetoric to action, we need to redistribute wealth in international development and work in solidarity with local civil society experts like Nawari, because their example is just one of many Claim Your Water Rights success stories. Another one, in 2021, our member Vision Africa Regional Network, otherwise known as VRN, documented evidence that two giant Chinese brewing companies have been polluting people's water in Luapula province, Zambia. One of the brewing companies simply dismissed the evidence. They had a cozy relationship with the previous government and they thought that would protect them. So VRN recommended that the newly elected provincial government close their offices, and they obliged. Both companies were then forced to publicly sign business and human rights commitments, contain redress measures, as a condition for resuming operations. And in March this year, Bahrain have compelled another 15 private mining companies to sign these commitments. That action cost us £7,500. So this action also highlights arguably the most important contextual consideration for advancing water justice, which is the state of a country's civic space. So Bahrain's work is a great example of government and civil society working cooperatively to enforce corporate compliance and climate justice. However, some members work in much more restrictive socio-political contexts. Some have to navigate complex security challenges or press censorship. Others face less acute but still pernicious forms of suppression, where civil society participation is purely tokenistic. Some have had non-violent protests met with police detentions and brutality. I mean, just a few weeks ago, the Indonesian government tried to shut down the People's Water Forum in Bali, with police and paramilitaries disrupting events, blockading activists, targeting local groups such as the People's Coalition for the Right to Water. So some members are therefore very careful in how they frame and approach their activism. For example, in Odisha in India, politicians perceive the idea of lodging complaints to be inherently provocative. So instead, our member, the Indian Institute of Youth and Development, makes representations to local authorities and to national human rights commissions. One example is they accompanied an Adivasi community of around 1,000 people to make a representation to their National Scheduled Tribes Commission concerning Alaka toilets. The commission's subsequent report showed that the money allocated to the toilets had been spent despite no construction work taking place. And the government later admitted that they just didn't think the community would complain. When the commission then received the representation, the government immediately started constructing toilets. So we estimate that the multiple representations that Indian Institute of Youth and Development have supported in Odisha has facilitated around 60,000 to 70,000 people to secure tangible improvements to water sanitation services, infrastructure, and financing. This was touched on in earlier presentations, but it's important to pick up again. I think the dehumanization and delegitimization of marginalized peoples must also be redressed if we're going to secure a just water future. In Pakistan, sanitation workers, as Lyla mentioned, are historically among the most oppressed groups due to their social status, caste, and in most cases, their religion. They're often expected to do their job with minimal pay, without personal protective equipment, medical insurance, or healthcare. So our member, Centre for Law and Justice, used the Claim Your Water Rights campaign to connect the struggle for water and sanitation with the struggle for workers' rights. After all, one person's right to good sanitation must not come at the expense of another person's right to decent work. This is where intersectionality comes in. So during the pandemic, Centre for Law and Justice started a movement for sanitation workers' rights. They convinced the Punjab Assembly to pass an historic resolution that recognized sanitation workers as frontline heroes in the fight against COVID. Now, the Pakistan Supreme Court subsequently issued a directive to the government to provide PPE, and they then invited Centre for Law and Justice to draft legislation that would enshrine sanitation workers' rights for the first time. I think I've not been great on the old slides, but I'll get that. So as Centre for Law and Justice's Asif Akil says, it should be people demanding their water rights, not an organisation speaking on their behalf. Human rights and water justice will remain theoretical concepts so long as we continue to consider them in abstract, passive terms. Our members' work shows that it's possible to put human rights principles into practice. We have the pledges, we have the policies, we have the frameworks, we have the laws, we have the international legal obligations. Now we need to enforce them. So thank you.
Thank you so much. What an incredible organization, incredible work that you're doing. And just the figures you mentioned are absolutely mind-blowing, absolutely remarkable. I think I'm going to skip my chair's question for now, if you're all okay, because we're running out of time, but I really want to leave space for audience questions. So we'll open up the floor. I've got a question online already, but if there's anyone in the room who has questions, we'll collect a few questions and then we'll come back to the panel. Yes, go ahead. That's you.
Okay. Hi, thank you all for being here. My name is Greta. I'm in the MSc in Water Science Policy and Management here, but I also took Catherine's Water Justice course in Hilliard. So my question is kind of more going towards like the academia and the I guess like interaction between academia and activism. I feel like within the academic space, a huge part of like academic capital is how much papers or how many papers you can produce and how much citations you can get and different things like that. And I see like this call for, you know, slow research and intuitive research to kind of conflict with that kind of like capital of academia. So I'm curious about how do we overcome that when doing activism and pursuing activism.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, my name is Matthew from Solomon. I'm a lecturer in anthropology from the University of Johannesburg. So it's connected to the question, and thanks again for the amazing panel. But also a key part of being an academic is also being a teacher. And so my question is how you translate these pedagogically. I teach a course in anthropology of climate change, which actually opened with loss of time as peace and decolonizing climate coloniality. And I find that within the context of the global south, the decolonial lens is really necessary for teaching, because it allows students who often think of climate change as a wide issue to articulate it to the kind of lived experience and concerns. But I wondered if you have in your experience any ideas of pedagogically how these translate into teaching these ideas for justice.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Leon. I'm a lecturer at the University of Hertfordshire. Thank you all for these panels are really interesting. I'm just kind of recently learning more about water injustice and decolonization process in water allocation. And coming from a background of land, access to land, I'm interested in more the rural areas. And one of the problems that I encountered is lack of data. Like you mentioned, we shouldn't focus just on the urban areas, but I found there's so much focus on urban areas. Not that it's not important, but when I wanted to try some, like find case studies or examples on, I can find who has access to water in rural areas, but not how much, especially when we talk about access to like groundwater or like riparian rights or with allocation of surface waters. There's no data on how much people actually withdraw, how much big corporations withdraw compared to like small holders. So there's not really much of a question here. Maybe if you have some comments about like, I don't know, some shared frustration there or something, I don't know.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just add the question online because it follows on nicely from that. It's from Sunny Morgan, and they say, what is the role of multinational corporations in the abuses of water, especially Nestle, Coca-Cola, and global beer brands? So it picks up a bit on that competition you were talking about between corporations and rural areas. Yeah, so 4 questions there. The first one on more on slow research practice, the second on the pedagogy of justice, rural areas, then multinational corporations. So I don't know, anyone can jump in if you have thoughts.
Yeah, because you go first, I'll go after. Don't have to go in the same order.
All right, well, thank you everyone for these really great complex questions. They're really important. And there's no easy answer because these are one of those intractable issues that will keep coming up. You know, how do you get the data? How do you overcome these barriers? How do you deal with the pedagogy? So I'm going to try to see if I can answer some of these in order. So that interaction between, and I don't think all of us have to answer all the questions, we
Sure,
can pick and
course, yeah.
choose. So that question about interaction between academia and activism, right? Like how to do that slow scholarship, if I understood that question correctly. So I absolutely believe in the value of slow scholarship. It was actually put forth by a lot of feminist scholars in both the US and the UK and elsewhere. And that is an intentional pushback against that fetish of productivity in academia in terms of thin slicing and just quantity over quality. So many of us intentionally publish very few papers, but make sure that they contain the full complexity of our research rather than a bunch of publications. And now with ChatGPT and AI, we've got fake research papers that are coming out with fake academics as co-authors. So it's really, really a messy situation out there. And that does a really horrible disservice to our students who cannot adjudicate between predatory journals, predatory publishing, unpeer-reviewed articles, or fake AI written articles, right? So we're kind of working with that. So that kind of extractivist approach to academia is also something to contend with. But I think one of the ways to think about how to balance activism and academia is that, for me, I don't see it as separate. I see it as academia as part of scholar activism. Because in pedagogy, that question about pedagogy is a form of activism for many of us. We're teaching theories that matter. It is theories that lead to impact, theories that have meaning, theories that were created in the crucibles of lived experiences of people, rather than theory for theory's sake, or rather than just being armchair theorists. So for me, I don't see that distinction between academia and activism per se, even though obviously there's an activist sphere, right? But within academia, there is that kind of bias against activist academics. I don't really care. I do what I do, and I think I do it well, and there's enough people who enjoy my scholarship, so whatever other people think doesn't matter. As I noticed that you mentioned the term climate coloniality. It's a term I coined a few years ago in a publication, and my book with that title is coming out later this year. So, and the reason why I came to that was to look at how that colonial legacy of climate injustice and water injustice, to switch to your question about translating to pedagogy. I think we do need to teach the basic core contents of a course, right? We don't have a choice, but we can always give exemplars of how this translates into lived experience with material politics. And this is where I think some students will read our work as activist work, because we're showing them the politics and we're not rendering it technical. We're not rendering it apolitical the way maybe some folks do. So I think in terms of relating to the lived experiences, that's really important in pedagogy. And if you cannot take your classroom outside into the real world, you bring the real world into the classroom, whether that's via documentaries, videos, in terms of interviews. That's the way I've kind of handled it. Again, these are just quick answers off the top of my head. And I think the question about data, absolutely. I used to work in the rural landscape much longer than before I came to the urban research. You had to produce your own data if you wanted to do rural work. You had to go find it, measure it, right? In the urban area, you might have other sources, and then you can do compare and contrast. So yes, it is a frustration. And then the role of multinational corporations, well, absolutely, they're, very infamous for water abuse, especially like Nestle in drought-prone California, or Coca-Cola and drought-prone, Pachimara in India. So you have like all kinds of extractions, but it's not just extraction of groundwater and falling water tables and drinking water crisis, but it's all the water contamination from textile factories, from ready-made garments and fast fashion. Fast fashion has a huge water cost. So does agriculture, right? Why are we growing apricots in the deserts or oranges in the desert? These are, or avocado, these are water intensive crops. So, these kinds of questions need to be brought up in trade negotiations or at the COPs, at climate conference of parties, but also in water negotiations, because the virtual water that's leaving a watershed is often real material water feeding the watershed, right? So So I'll just leave it at that. And those are really very condensed responses to very complex questions, but I'll hand it over to our panelists.
Okay, just very briefly. So very good questions and very nice to hear everybody here. I mean, I work in development studies. It's a normative field, so I don't see there's any issue there. We can flit across the worlds of academia, policy, activism, and I think we need to do that more and more. Because there are wicked problems and they need multiple kind of solutions. And I guess as scholars, we need to be reflexive about our own positionality, about our own power and privilege or disadvantage due to race, class. And it's very important for us to speak truth to power, and we need to do that. And we are sitting in privileged positions in Oxford and IDS or wherever, so we really need to do that. But of course, also be humble and learn and unlearn, and don't impose our ideas and solutions and frameworks. So also that's part of people, but also don't overly romanticize the local, because there are dangers of that too. Now Hindutva is part of decolonization in India, so we have to be a little careful about that too. In terms of pedagogy, I think Farhan has argued it, but I think it is about showing it's all contested and it's all political, and there's no easy fix answers. So students often want the answers, but it's very tricky. So in a way, it's about learning about those politics. And I think when you do engaged research, that is based on fieldwork, you come up with the complexity, and you use that complexity to speak to some of these very simplistic global debates and narratives, be it around scarcity, be it around limits, be around the Anthropocene, etc. And I think that's also the role of pedagogy, and also the pedagogy of the powerful and the elites, because that's also something that we increasingly have to do, the overconsumption that you spoke about, etc. I did a lot of rural work, yes. I mean, the reason why water grabbing can take place is simply because of all this lack of data and the slipperiness and the fact that it's the nature of the resource. It's very different to land. So I kind of share your frustration, but there are ways to actually do those fine-grained studies and then take them and then to really hold these people to account, as with some of the processes you spoke about, the way activists and struggles are doing that. And finally, it was interesting. In 2000, I was a very early career researcher. I went to The Hague, and nobody wanted to talk about the human right to water, and least of all Nestle. Nestle, Vivendi, Suez, etc. Now, of course, they're all into the human right to water. But we know in the past 20 years what they've done, in terms of the extraction, in terms of what that means for quality around the world. And also they've got a lot of convening power. So they are at every single World Economic Forum, and they're talking there about water security, water risks, water scarcity. But you have to ask, whose security and whose risks are they concerned about? So it is really about holding these powerful actors increasingly to account, because they're all into the human right to water now. Everybody is, right? So in a way, it's about really pushing them, naming and shaming them, I think, increasingly is what we need to do. And also really support those local struggles that you spoke about. How do we, as we speak now, the Narmada, I started out as a young researcher in the Narmada Valley, looking at the struggle, the displacement. Dams are in now, right? So the IPCC thinks big dams are a form of renewable energy, but we still haven't sorted out the displacement of these people. And 40 years later, they're still sitting there. There's an indefinite fast as we speak, and people are still waiting for their rights. So, support those local struggles, give them the voice that they need, and hold the powerful to account.
I'll be quick. Greta and Matthew, I might just try and do yours together, but what I think is in the climate crisis, I was talking about the different ways of responding to it has a lot of potential in reforming and reimagining. And I think this is also true in academia. I think what the academics I see coming up across the world are very activists engage, right? And that can be in the academia, but also as the different positionalities they hold. So the kind of the slow iterative research, I think a lot of people, certainly young scholars, I think they are very aware of positioning themselves as not only academics, but showing and developing their different positionalities in different spaces. And this is something I've done, and a lot of people in the room have had and are doing, right? So then they try to, and in many ways, they're reshaping what academia can be and what kind of currencies are worthwhile in investing in academia. It's not only this kind of publication citation thing, but what kind of validity do we give to academics that we're surrounded by when we see the kind of activist, influence that they have and the kind of grounded work that they're doing. I think we're very lucky to be in a time where the university is in crisis, and it offers very good opportunities for a different kind of academic environment, I think. Matthew, yeah, a really, really interesting question. I think with these kind of not only new age academics, but different ways of thinking about being an academic, regardless of what career level you're at, I think assessment is really interesting. So something I've done in the past is asking students to go and map if I'm talking about infrastructure, if I'm talking about water, if I'm talking about environmental justice, they can go and do a kind of lived reality project first, and not giving them marks or Harvey or whatever, and then do some experiential work first, and understanding that the connection between their lived reality, what it might be in 10 years, and the kind of work that we're all doing as academics, they are intersections, and we shouldn't, go from theory and then work into kind of trying to find applicability in case studies. But there's also ways in which all of us have shown doing the work is very important in the lived reality. And this is also the reimagining of what institutions are and what students bring into these spaces, and then going from there. And then the language, we'll chat, but this is a really interesting question around water and underground water and the urban and rural thing. This is a project I'm doing now, so we'll chat about that. That's really interesting. Comrade Sunny, I'm not going to answer your question on INGOs, because I'm sure we'll.
I thought it was multinational corps, but that's fine. I was just going to pick up on data quickly, because it's also something that civil society constantly are wanting credible, disaggregated data. So one of the best things actually academics can do is align with those groups to provide the evidence for human rights violations, particularly in rural areas, among marginalized peoples as well. So yeah, just practically, that's a very good way of aligning your academia with activism. And yes, I mean, I think Fahana said it very succinctly. The abuse of multinational corporations like Nestle, Coca-Cola is pervasive, and we have members just on Coca-Cola in Mexico, India, US, just as examples where there's evidence that they're extracting water in perennially water-stressed regions, bottling it and selling it back to people who don't have water or don't have affordable water bills. So yes, corporate accountability is a key theme.
Sponsor a lot of the big NGOs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, they've inserted themselves into the system
Water
and into global governance as well. If you look at something like the World Water Forum, that's an example of global governance where private sector, in terms of these multinationals, in terms of Suez, Veolia, World Water Council, there are vested interests. So it's infiltration, really.
We've got a few more minutes, so I just want to take any more questions. Anyone who hasn't had a chance to speak. Okay. John, yeah.
This is for Professor Sultana. I'm a second year PhD student here. I look at community management in rural water supply in India. So your work in Bangladesh has sort of been like my Bible for a long time, especially Fluid Lives. I think I've lost count of how many times I've read that. So you spoke about intersectionality, and it is a lens that I am very big fan of, very interested in. I think it brings together a lot of problems. And then I run into quite a few academic debates here where I was hit with this from one of the professors. It's like intersectionality doesn't work in the South Asian context because of this. I think it's Nivedita Menon's work from India, and it was just like, there are two main criticisms to it, which I'm actually currently struggling to answer in my own work, in which I'm using intersectionality, is one, it's sort of like taking something from the West and again, trying to make sense of South Asian realities within that framework. And the second one is that the problem of categorization and how it's not, the tendency to make it sort of an additive problem, that gender and caste and this and that, rather than constitutive. I am still very determined to use it in my DPhil. But yeah, I think, I mean, just to sort of ask you, how do you really make a very strong case for intersectionality, given these two bodies of criticism?
Thanks.
Yeah,
And
okay.
do you want to, sorry, can I just take a few questions? Go ahead. Stan.
Thanks very much. My name's Fred. I'm an anthropology postdoc. I work on water in Jordan at the LSE. Fantastic discussion. Likewise, a great fan of his work. I work on claim making and contestation, and so I was thinking a little bit around that. And it sort of there are kind of two sort of areas of this. One is kind of overt claim making through official forums and formal protest, and I work in a rural protest group, which is tackling actually both a dam and groundwater over extraction at the same time, and is already an area with a long history of protest and labour union organisation and more or less rebellion, and they use water to sort of instantiate a much broader critique of Jordanian political economy and the sort of environmental colonialism, really, in which they live, and of course it's deeply connected to the sort of hydro-hegemony of Israel as well. But on top of that, their movement gets sort of conflated around the edges in the national discourse with people making a different sort of claim making, right, which is just connecting themselves to water informally. I think Bayek talks about this, right? The quiet encroachment kind of stuff. And I think that connects to some of the panelists talking about this sort of problem with volumetric water, right? And sort of the issue of quantification. And it's sort of I sort of struggle with this, that informal claim making is sort of used as a sort of discursive device to discredit water protest in general, right? And it seems to me that there's something tricky going on when the real sort of subversion of the water system, we're talking about, people investing in illegal wells, vast infrastructural subversions of pipelines to often just to irrigate land so it can be claimed, right, in land grabs. And but it's constantly blamed on the very small actors, people in informal settlements, and often the powerless refugees in Jordan, Palestinians overwhelmingly, who don't have the kind of connections and the patronage networks to protect them, who are just trying to connect themselves to the network in any way they can. So I'm wondering what role different types of claim making might have in water activism, and if we can do more to kind of to challenge the sort of apolitical technocratic narrative, which places all the blame on kind of managerial issues. And also I feel that leads into, sorry, this is an even broader bit to add to the question, but I feel that actually conflates with a lot of the sort of move towards big supply side mega projects, right? Which become the only, we don't need to worry about these little things, because at the end of the day, we just need to sort the supply out with some sort of new massive project with a whole layer of financialization and investment. Anyway, that's a lot of thoughts to throw in at the very end.
Okay, great. So we've got two questions, one on intersectionality, one on claim making, and then a final question from online, which I think is a really nice way to wrap up the panel. If you had a magic wand to influence the general masses about the politics of water, what would you like to see happen?
Can you repeat that last question again?
If you had a magic wand to influence the general masses about the politics of water, what would you like to see happen? And that's from Dia G online.
Ron, if you want to answer the first section.
All right. So the critique that intersectionality doesn't apply to India because of its, anti-colonial stance. Yes, that is a valid critique, but the way I see intersectionality is that it's one of the critical frameworks for women of color. which is what Jennifer Nash had also argued in 2015, I believe, that it is a critical framework that you can apply, but yes, it has been co-opted. It has been co-opted, it has been misused, especially by the US government. The CIA claims to be intersectional, but they don't understand what the hell they're talking about. The IDF claims to be intersectional, and I'm like, well, okay, yes, intersectional genocide, sure. But so it's become a buzzword. But if you look at it, the critical meaning, as it was developed by Black feminist scholars such as Kimberly Crenshaw, but Crenshaw didn't invent it. She relied on previous work, yeah? And that comes from, whether it's the Black anti-colonial feminists or whether it's the Gulagichi Nation, or if you think about the post-colonial feminists that predate Crenshaw. My take on intersectionality is it is a critical framework to look at these politics of difference, but also politics of material lived reality. And everyone can be anti-colonial and not anti-colonial at the same time. And the reason why I find it still a useful category to look at is because water plays out along those intersectional lines of, let's say, you cannot just talk about women, you have to talk about rich women, poor women. You have to talk about disabled women, non-disabled women. So that therefore means I have to look at the way that people can occupy multiple positionalities at the same time. Right? So in terms of thinking about whether it doesn't apply in certain contexts, I'm not sure how, let's say, I would rather probably listen to what Dalit scholars are saying about how to understand this, because I think they have a very different perspective on that relationship between ecology and humanity in terms of understanding that positioning of in a colonized post-colonial landscape. And I'm not as familiar with Dalit's feminist scholarship to be able to articulate about that. But I am familiar with the Black feminist scholarship out of the US and the post-colonial feminist scholarship from across the global South. But I think there is more to be added to that, but recognizing that it's a useful framework, especially in water. Maybe not in all contexts, but in water it definitely does, because there's a real problem in the way that's even, documents in the United Nations will, and I've had this problem like when I worked for the United Nations over 20 years ago, it was always like categories like women, children, labor. And I was like, well, there can be women who are laborers and children who are gender identifying as people to become new young women. Like this, what is this women category and how is it separate from the children and the laborers and indigenous people, as if there aren't women indigenous laborers? Like what? So these categorizations need that problematization, right? So I think this is where it comes up, but then at the same time recognizing that it is not an infinite number of intersectional lenses. It is what is contextually, politically most relevant in terms of looking at injustice. So for instance, somebody critiquing my work that it doesn't have race involved means they weren't paying attention to the context. Race doesn't apply to largely homogeneously ethnic community. Whereas if I'm working in my work in the United States, I have to apply a racial lens because it is a highly racially segregated settler colonial context, right? So context matters in those kind of politics of identity and politics of division when it comes to material outcomes and lived experiences of privileges and harms in terms of power relations. So the way I think of it is in terms of material outcomes of power relations in local contexts. Whether you use a different term than intersectionality or not, so be it.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I keep on citing you, but this is good. I can go and tell you.
My off the cuff response is a part of citational politics. You wouldn't be the first one. My tweets get cited too. So
maybe a response to the magic wand. So I guess magic wand around how to address the politics of water. So one is to embrace the political nature of water, and also issues around uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. We try and shut that out, so that leads to kind of top-down technocratic solutions. So that doesn't really work. it also kind of means challenging these dominant narratives around crisis, around scarcity, around governance. The third issue, I think, is really to push for accountability. There's very little accountability in the water sector, from local to global. So at the global level, you have Security Council kind of announcements, and it makes no difference because the genocide is still going on, and even at the local level. So how do you actually push for that? How do you call out the violations? So I think more naming and shaming, so calling that out and finding ways to realize basic rights, I guess. And that includes, you know, demanding accountability from states, companies that pollute, that extract, etc. You know, take history seriously. So I guess redressing historical injustices in South Africa and India, the caste system, and that links with some of the intersectionality issues. And I guess then also exploring and alternative vocabularies and practices and knowledges. So issues around care, solidarity, reciprocity, redistribution, you know, we can find alternative metaphors. And it is a long, long road. It's a long struggle. And I think you know that from South Africa. It took forever. And I guess also we just have to realize it. And we have shrinking civic spaces, democracy shrinking everywhere. Activists are going in jail even for tweets. So you're lucky. You can tweet if you want, but others can't. So I guess we have to realize this long struggle and, you know, support those who are on the ground actually doing the struggle. Anyway, thanks.
I know the first question wasn't addressed to me, but yeah, thinking about not intersectionality as a structural principle, but as an assemblage of bringing in different identities and aspects of our multiplicity of our positionalities that we hold, I think is very important. So not thinking of it only as these are the 4 categories or parts of intersectionality that one's raising or working through, but it's, as Ron was saying, it's far more complex, and I was saying as well, it's far more complex and muddy, and at different times it articulates in different ways, right? Not just having a tick box, I think is important. Fred, very interesting and claim making. I think trying to destabilize a critique of the political economy of water by saying, you know, there's informal claim making, and this is exactly what happened in Cape Town before the drought, and as the drought struck, people were saying, well, the informal settlements, there's water running down the roads, they're using so much water. But it is a narrative to push back against the broader critique of the political economy of water, right? And broader infrastructure, the state, big infrastructure question of, oh, we'll solve it all because we'll build a big dam. I think these are, again, ways of power or capital trying to navigate these critiques that, you know, can be destabilized. And so not only can the critique be bolstered in various ways, but it can be destabilized in very many ways. And I think these are processes of trying to delegitimize, you know, and we see this across various forms of politics, not only water and environmental. The magic wand will be very simple, and I'll just try and make sure that everyone knows that water inequality and inequity that we've been speaking about today is not natural. And that kind of realization will open up frontiers for contestation here.
Yeah, I can just add to that. I mean, I agree and agree with everything that Lyla said as well. You know, I'd want people to understand that the water and sanitation crisis is profoundly political. There's often a narrative that, you know, it's a tragedy of circumstance, it's a scarcity of resource, tragedy of geography. That's not true. It's from colonial legacies, it's from prioritizing people, profit over people, it's from deregulation, it's from climate injustice, you know, it's from extracting a precious resource faster than we are replenishing it. An economic system that does that, you know, is profoundly political. So I'd want people to understand that water isn't something that should be captured, controlled, or commodified. Water is a human right, a public service, and a common good.
Thank you. I think one last thing we haven't said is public financing. I think we really need to emphasize public financing, and from local to global, and at the national realm too, because that is often lost. And you know, as you mentioned, with aid shrinking and this government also cutting its global commitments to development, so really pushing for that. That's something concrete that can be done.
and making sure it goes to the local
The
activists
local,
the
yeah, the
right-
right places.
who are more efficient and more effective.
Any burning final comment from the panel? No. All right, please join me in giving great thanks to our panel today. Thank you very much.